Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to. I call Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Labor Party to indicate our support for the first reading of this bill. When announcements were made earlier in the year that the government was firstly signing up as a foundation member and then secondly to contribute money, we supported that on the grounds that essentially this bank is going to happen, it's going to be established, it's going to become a very important player in our region, and it's something that as New Zealand looks to expand opportunities for our involvement and our development with the wider Asian region, we should be a part of. Mr Speaker, it was quite clear in the Minister's speech that he's just given that he expressed some of the surprise that others did at the pace at which developments have occurred with the establishment of the Asia Infrastructure Bank. I want to say that that's the small note of caution that I'd like to sound, and I think when the Select Committee has some time to go through the bill, one of the things that we would want them to do is to look closely at those governance arrangements and the way in which safeguards have been included within the establishment of the bank because of that particular reason, the pace, but also because this is uncharted territory for an initiative led by the Chinese government. The Minister himself used the language very early on when this was being debated that some commentators had seen this as some kind of expanded Chinese SOE, and that he was reflecting the concerns of countries that's what we were facing up to. It's quite clear in the development since that time that that concern has significantly reduced, but it is vitally important that the governance arrangements that are built around this bank have the level of transparency, have the level of accountability that we would expect from a multilateral institution like this. And Mr Speaker, I've got confidence in the likes of John Whitehead and others to have involved us in an agreement only if they felt that was possible. But that is the job of the Select Committee, to ensure that we have those safeguards in place and that we're confident about the governance issues. What I can say, Mr Speaker, is that in terms of what this will mean for the coherence of infrastructure development across the Asia region can only be positive. I think anyone who's spent time in the Asia-Pacific region and seen the more ad hoc style of infrastructure development that can take place can see how that can cause some problems. If a large country, and it often is China, but it can be other countries, find their way into the Asia-Pacific region and support a particular one-off project, it isn't always the most effective or efficient way of ensuring that that infrastructure dollar is well spent. When we look at what lies behind the AIIB, we can see that it is indeed an attempt to create a very coherent form of infrastructure development right through those Asian nations that the Minister mentioned in his speech. So I think that will be an extremely positive development out of the establishment of the bank if we can get that kind of coherence into what is clearly a rapidly growing region, but one where there are significant infrastructure gaps. The World Bank and the Asian Development Bank have, certainly in the initial stages of this idea being floated, been very critical of the idea that a separate mechanism was required. Anyone who's spent any time in the Asia region will hear from governments their criticisms of the World Bank and the IMF, that they don't believe that they are sufficiently focused or have sufficient knowledge of the Asian region to be able to give the leadership in infrastructure development that a bank focused and based inside the Asian region would be able to do. The World Bank have said that a further $1 trillion annually is needed to support economic growth in the region. That is a massive sum of money to be able to find. So the arrival of a domestically or a regionally located bank like this clearly will be an important element in getting towards meeting some of those growth goals. Mr Speaker, New Zealand already benefits from expanding growth across the Asian region. It is vital to our future success, and the development of infrastructure is equally vital in that context as well. We believe New Zealand does need a seat at the table when these kinds of initiatives begin, and we do believe that the bank is likely to become a very influential institution across the Asian continent. By being there now, we are best placed to exert some influence over the direction work and governance of the bank. It is important to note that New Zealand's contribution over the next 5 years will be a fairly modest $126 million, with a possible further commitment of $504 million of callable capital. This is a large investment in terms of just raw dollar figures, but across the many billions of dollars required in the region, it is quite small. But we do think that there are significant benefits in terms of increased economic development in the Asian region, supporting that economic integration, as I mentioned before, and augmenting New Zealand's other relationships that it has in the Asian region. We are not as represented in some of the places where the bank will be doing its work as we could be. This offers a way of New Zealand being a part of the development of those countries. We particularly think it will, if done well, improve the operational standards and the safeguards around infrastructure development by having a more coherent process. Clearly, it builds on our very good and strong relationship with China. Some commentators have likened this to being the fifth first, where New Zealand was there. As anyone who's been to China will have been part of a speech talking about the four firsts. Mr. Goff certainly has given plenty of those. He was there for most of them. But where New Zealand has always been at the forefront of recognising China as a market economy, of supporting its involvement in multilateral institutions like the WTO, beginning negotiations for a free trade agreement, and then eventually being the first country to settle a free trade agreement with China. They were the four firsts. Some people see New Zealand's early involvement with the bank as a fifth first. That can only be positive for developing our relationships in China. Mr. Speaker, we do support this legislation, but I do want to note the very odd way in which the government has chosen to finance its contribution into the fund. It's done that through the Future Investment Fund. And the Future Investment Fund is a well-used mechanism by the government for when it wants to find some money. It was, as people will recall, the fund that was to be created by the sale of state assets. Around $4 billion ended up in it. Won't go into how that didn't end up being what it was going to be, but $4 billion ended up in this. And we've sat in this House year after year, Mr. Speaker, and heard government ministers stand up to tell us that things will be funded out of the Future Investment Fund. And it's not surprising that we came to the budget this year to discover that the Future Investment Fund is now oversubscribed. So with all the commitments that the government's made for the things that it originally said the Future Investment Fund would be used for, education and health specifically, and building that infrastructure here in New Zealand, there is still outstanding of that hundreds of millions of dollars that have not yet been spent. Yet the government seems to be able to find the room, in this case, to find $125 million to go and spend on the bank. By all means, be part of this, but that's not what the Future Investment Fund was meant to be for. The Future Investment Fund was quite clearly designed to be spent on things like education, on building schools, on building hospitals here in New Zealand. Now, it was always an illusion. It was always an accounting trick by the government, but the gall to come to this House and say, here we are, we're going to fund New Zealand's contribution to this very worthy initiative by raiding the Future Investment Fund, which we've already overspent. It's not without irony, Mr. Speaker, for people who are sitting in the regions of New Zealand wanting an infrastructure boost, wanting to see some roads developed, perhaps for the forestry sector on the east coast, or maybe it's the Apotiki Wharf, and they say, well, wouldn't it be good to get some of that Future Investment Fund into our infrastructure? And we can understand how people would see that as somewhat ironic to be using that fund. But it's a track record that the government should not be proud of. They managed to spend $6 million fixing the roof of the Beehive. That was apparently worthy of the Future Investment Fund. $8 million for the census. That also came from the Future Investment Fund. This is not the health and education infrastructure that New Zealanders were promised to come out of the Future Investment Fund. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it's pretty disingenuous of the government to claim that they can keep on raiding that fund, which is already overspent, already overcommitted, I should say, and when they haven't been able to follow through on the education and health funding that was meant to occur on this. So we now see the government being about $364 million short of the spending on schools it promised under the Future Investment Fund, about $316 million short on the health funding. They have failed to find the funding that was needed for that, yet still try to pretend that this is where the funding will come from for this particular initiative. So we would be interested in looking into that as we go through this in the select committee process, is to see exactly where this funding is coming from, because quite frankly I don't believe it. Mr Speaker, I just want to finish, because I know you'll sit me down in a moment, on the slightly odd motion that the Minister moved at the start on a truncated select committee process. I certainly appreciate the need to get this done by the end of the year, but we would be asking the question why the government is so disorganised it has to keep coming to House with such motions.
I call Shane Retty.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise to the